Hello and welcome back to Marineford TCG. My name's Joe, drink of the day is a Thatcher's Juicy Apple Cider, and today I'm taking a quick discussion about why there's going to be a ban list, what the format looks like currently, both in the West and the East, and what I think will and should be banned. So jumping straight into it, credit for the data on the first two slides goes to gumgum.gg. If you're looking for deck lists, I'm not sponsored by them, but if you're looking for deck lists, gumgum.gg is easily the best one for Eastern data. They've got all the flagships, most of the CS lists that become available, as well as interesting data like this. And this is the data for the Japanese OP12 format, which is the format they're currently playing. Now, one thing to note is the start decks that we got quite a while ago, the ones that included like the Buggy deck and the Shanks deck, they released a lot later in Japan. So their data is not going to be including those start decks anywhere near as much as it is for the West. In the West, we got those with the release of OP11. In the East, they got those like halfway through OP12. But if you look at the data, especially focusing in on the CS data, that's their equivalent of regionals. These flagships and store battles are sort of the equivalent of store treasure cups or store regionals. And then the store battles are just like locals. You can really see from this data that blue-purple Luffy has been far and away the best deck in this format, both for flagships and store battles as well, but especially at CSs, this has been incredibly dominant, and we've seen that in the videos that we've been commentating over on the channel. Now, one interesting thing to note is that in the West, the most prevalent counter to these Luffy decks has been Bello Betty. In the East, they've not had the luxury of that, because Green Zoro is a very powerful deck in its own right, and this deck shuts down Bello Betty like no other. Both the Kuina and the Chigi that are able to rest Bello Betty's characters before they're able to get going, just kind of nuke that deck. And Zoro's been an incredibly popular deck. So Bello Betty has not seen the success that it's seen in the West, in the East, and as a result, you've seen even more of these green-purple and blue-purple Luffy decks topping. The premier aggro deck has actually been Red Rayleigh, a deck that's not out yet in the West, which is sort of the new age version of Red Zoro. And you can see that here in 4th place with some finishes and a good amount of flagship wins. Moving back to OP11, and Japan didn't have that many big regionals in the OP11 format. However, they have had a lot of flagships, and I mean, you can clearly see far and away in the Japanese OP11 format, Blue-Purple Luffy was the best deck by a country mile. 150 flagships, with 2nd place being Green-Purple at 53, is just a gargantuan margin to be ahead by. And we do see Bello Betty here in the 3rd place, sort of demonstrating what I mean about Green Zoro, just removing Bello Betty from the format, which has again allowed these purple Luffys to thrive not only in OP11 but into OP12 too, with very little disruption. And I think the Japanese data is the more important data likely for Bandai when they're choosing to ban these cards. At the end of the day, the team that chooses to ban the cards is from Bandai Japan. So whilst I'm sure they do pay attention to Western results, I think the Eastern results are the main thing to go off. And if you look at these, it's very clear to see that nothing is even challenging Blue-Purple Luffy, and Blue-Purple Luffy has sort of warped the meta around it. And as you go down this chart further, you do see a lot of other aggro decks, like the Red Rayleigh and the GY Law, that also have very reasonable matchups into Blue-Purple. With the exception of Teach and arguably Bonnie, though Bonnie also gets to play Hody Jones. It very much feels like you're either playing Blue-Purple, or you're playing one of these aggressive decks that has access to, in most cases, Hody Jones, and in Green-Purple's case, it has Dead Man's Game, and Rayleigh just has ridiculous aggression. You've got to beat this deck by aggression, because you can't outlast it. This deck has the most insane endgame we've ever seen. And you can equally see that in the OP11 format. Whilst there was a significant amount of Rob Lucci, which was able to deal with Blue-Purple Luffy somewhat with the Tenkos Kuzan, if Blue-Purple Luffy was able to remove that Tenkos Kuzan, Rob Lucci was kind of out of luck. And in OP12, especially once they got those start decks, and as you'll see in the Western results soon, Lucci did not perform this well in the West. We had the Buggy starter deck, and Buggy was an incredibly popular deck that kind of just hard countered Lucci, with that Croc-Hawk able to negate his removal completely. And as a result, that was the only endgame deck that could rival Blue-Purple Luffy in the East, and that's been taken off the table for the West. So in the West, as you'll see in a moment, it's much the same, but look at these decks, right? Bello Betty, Green-Purple, and Zoro, they're all aggro decks. Lucci was trying to rival Luffy's endgame, Purple Luffy is another very aggressive deck that plays out cards like the 8-cost Kata and the 9-cost Luffy, and that 9-cost Luffy especially is very, very difficult for Blue-Purple Luffy to deal with. And that was Purple Luffy's way of trying to get over Blue-Purple, was by spamming that 9-cost Luffy to keep drawing cards and slamming those 10k swings that were very awkward for Blue-Purple to deal with. And you've also got, at the bottom, you've got Smoker, who is again another aggressive green deck with access to Jones. You'd also have Teach, who is a bit of an oddball, and I'm quite surprised he was doing this well in Japan. I'm not really sure why, because when we go over to the Western results for OP11, Teach has not been doing this well. And let's go over now. So I'm sorry it's not as pretty, but these are the Western results for all of the regionals that we've had in OP11. And this is the top decks, whether it's top 32, top 16, or top 8. And these are the amount of decks that have made tops according to Eggman events. So big shout out to Eggman events for the data, and I've just accumulated it into this table. And one of the most interesting things is we've actually seen Green-Purple Luffy doing better than Blue-Purple Luffy. And I think the main culprit for that is Buggy. So Buggy is a deck that actually has a pretty reasonable Blue-Purple Luffy matchup. The 10-cost Buggy that's able to remove their stuff and develop a 10-12 is very powerful into Blue-Purple, because they can't deal with these 12k swings. They're just too big for even Katakuri to block efficiently. And Buggy's able to negate Blue-Purple's removal by cards like Lin Lin or Raging Tiger or even Red Rock. So there's not a lot they can do about these Buggies once they start sticking. As a result, you've seen a lot more Green-Purple doing well, because Green-Purple is incredibly good into Buggy. This is also another reason why we've seen Zoro see basically no success. If we look back to the East, Zoro was the 4th most successful deck. And in the West, Zoro has had one top. And a lot of this, in my opinion, is because it does worse than Betty into Blue-Purple Luffy. And also arguably worse than Betty into Buggy. So Buggy is a deck that should shut down below Betty. But sometimes Buggy just has those awkward hands where they don't see the perfect curve, or they don't see the foot Buggy at all, and Betty can run away with it. And Betty does play a good amount of characters that are not 3 and 4 costs, such as the 6-cost Koala, the 5-cost Ivankov, and even their 1 and 2 costs can swing into Buggy for just leader effect. And if Betty can tax enough cards out of Buggy in that early game, the matchup really isn't as bad as some people, myself included, thought it would be. We have still seen, though, the top 2 decks remain unchanged from Japan's OP11 format. We have seen Luffy and Luffy, followed by Betty. Top 3 has stayed exactly the same as it was in Japan, which demonstrates that those starter decks, whilst they have impacted the meta somewhat, they've not changed what's doing the best. And I think those starter decks were Bandai's attempt to try and sort of slow down these Luffy decks a little bit, with all those cards that can increase the power of your leader. You had the 9-cost Shanks, the Law and Beppo, and the Beer Luffy, all looking to make the leaders bigger, so that you could go over the top of the Blue-Purple and Green-Purple Luffy leaders that sat at 6 by going to 7. However, it's just not really panned out like that. The best performing starter deck was by far Buggy, and following that, it was Purple Black Luffy, who did incredibly well on the opening weekend over in America. He had 5 tops at the first regional in Oviedo. However, as the format's developed, more people have worked out what the Purple Black Luffy deck is doing, and it's become much easier to counter and predict. Now, whilst this distribution of deck percentages might not actually look like a problem, in fact, I mean, Blue-Purple Luffy's not even number 1 in the West by regional tops. I think looking at what leaders are represented heavily in this format, and the ways that they've changed their builds into the OP11 format, it sort of gives a different picture. Now, as you look down this list, one thing that's interesting to note, if you reference the TCG matchmaking online sim data, there are very few decks on this list that have significantly losing matchups into Blue-Purple. According to the most recent TCG matchmaking data, the only decks on this list that have a significantly losing matchup into Blue-Purple Luffy is Blackbeard at 55% and Bonnie at 64%. So Bonnie is kind of just an answer to all the decks that are trying to answer Blue-Purple Luffy. It's going in that like triangle. Bonnie is very good into decks like Green-Purple Luffy, into Betty, and into Buggy. Blackbeard, according to the death data, has bad matchups into both Luffy and both UP Luffy and GP Luffy. So I think Blackbeard is just a bit of an outlier, capitalizing on maybe good matchup spreads or more inexperienced players with the matchup. However, you look at the rest of these and they all have positive or even matchups with Blue Purple Luffy. And I think one of the biggest fall-offs that sort of exacerbates how centralized this meta has become around UP Luffy is Shanks. In both Set 9 and Set 10, Shanks was a really good deck. People would argue whether or not it was the best deck, but it was certainly a very powerful deck. I mean, it made the finals of the World Championships. There's no arguing that it was a good deck in OP09 and OP10. However, in OP11, Shanks has immediately just fallen off because it can't beat Blue Purple Luffy. Blue Purple Luffy has a ridiculously favoured 68.5% win rate into Shanks, according to the sim data, and it just goes to show that losing significantly to this deck, unless you're like reliably beating all of its counters, like Bonnie can do, which Shanks can't. Shanks was already sort of struggling into GP in the EBO2 format, but now that it has a significantly losing matchup into the best deck in the game, and a tricky matchup into the second best, it's just not viable. Shanks is not a viable deck anymore. And for me, that's a really good example of just how important that Blue-Purple Luffy matchup has become. And that's why I think this meta is too centered around Blue-Purple Luffy. And something's got to go. And that's clearly what Bandai thinks too, because they've announced this ban list. So these are the 4 decks that I think most people have their eyes on. Blue, Purple, and Green Purple have been the titans of OP11 and also OP12 over in Japan. They are inarguably 2 of the top 3 decks in both formats, with the 3rd slot being taken up by Betty in OP11 in the West and Zoro in OP12 in the East. So when they're going to be looking at bans, I think these are the 4 decks that they're going to primarily look at. And I'm going to cover Betty first because I think there is absolutely no reason for anything in the Betty deck to be banned. Betty's gained next to nothing in the last 2 sets. It's basically running the exact same cards it was back in like OP09 and OP10. The only difference is the meta has shifted, and Betty has seen much more success because of its positive win rates into both of these. The play rates are even higher for both of these decks. They're through the roof, and Betty has positive matchups into both GP and UP, so that's why she's doing well. And if these decks were different, I bet Betty's play rate would fall off. The deck isn't inherently broken, it's just very good into these other decks. Zoro is a new deck out of OP12, and it's very hard to properly assess Zoro because it exists in a meta where these 2 are so insane that it's tough to work out whether or not Zoro's cards are balanced because all the focus at the minute is on these guys. I do personally think there's a couple of cards in Zoro that are worth talking about though, because this deck, despite having a little bit of an iffy matchup into Blue Purple Luffy, has performed incredibly well in Japan and sort of taken Betty completely out of the meta. First, let's focus in on the meta warper of the format, Blue Purple Luffy. For me, there are 3 cards in this deck that are clear outliers: the Leader, Giant, and Linlin. The Leader itself is a strong ban contender. Bandai have shown in the past they're not afraid to ban leaders. Sakazuki's banned, Whitebeard used to be banned, and RP Law is very much banned. So I wouldn't be surprised to see this go. The efficiency you get at the end of the game once you get to that 10-on turn, where you can start using the Leader effect, tutoring 2 of the top 5 in pretty much any combination, as long as one of them's Straw Hat, and in addition to that, letting you set up the top of your deck for your Sanji combos is just utterly bonkers. No other deck's endgame even comes close, and this makes it really hard for other late game, mid-range decks, like say Bonnie or Shanks, to play into you because you're simply drawing more cards and playing bigger characters. In addition to this, Linlin is just ridiculous. Linlin removing so many cards, like things like Cavendish, things like Smoker, things like ST21 Luffy, makes it really hard for especially 5 and 6 cost characters to exist. Because you play them, and if they don't have insane on-plays, they're just gone. They're gone in your life, and traditionally, you getting to heal would be great. You wouldn't mind it as much as if it was just removed. However, the fact that Luffy's endgame is just a board of 4, 5, 9Ks, you can't defend out of those swings easily. So it creates a position where Luffy doesn't care how many lives you've got. He's going to win eventually. You've got to kill him before he can develop this big board. And that's so much easier said than done because of Linlin's heal and the final card I want to talk about, Gum Gum Giant. In my opinion, there is no way this card does not get hit. People are fed up of Gum Gum Giant, and it's really, for me, just due to both blue purple and green purple. In mono purple Luffy and purple black Luffy, this card's great. It's nowhere near as obnoxious as it is in UP and GP. However, I just don't see a world where they don't hit this, unless they want to hit green purple seriously in another way, which we'll discuss on the next slide. I think that there's no way this card survives. People are too fed up of it. In addition, this is just the best counter event we've ever seen. It's essentially costs you 0 cards. You get 4,000 power for 1 Don and a trash 1 draw 2. It's just too efficient. Cards like a 10-layer Igloo and Hell's Judgment have similar efficiencies, but they don't give you a trash 1 draw 2. The fact that Luffy can counter a 9,000 power swing into his leader and essentially benefit because he can trash a brick and maybe draw into 2 more useful cards while cycling through his deck is just, it's just not balanced. This Don -2 doesn't matter in a deck like blue purple Luffy. And even in green purple Luffy, where that should matter, it ends up just not mattering, which is kind of bizarre, as we'll talk about on the next slide. But yeah, for me, out of this deck, Gum Gum Giant is getting hit. There's no way this is escaping. And also, I think they will ban one of Lin Lin or Luffy, the leader. For me, Lin Lin is the problem. I personally think the removal on top of healing is just not balanced. And whilst this is currently only very, very powerful in blue purple, we've seen it in the past be really obnoxious in mono purple Luffy. And I think this is just going to cause issues again in the future when we get a similarly powerful purple leader that can take good advantage of this. However, they could just ban the leader. It is the easy way out, and potentially who knows, they may take that route. Moving on to green purple Luffy, is he also a problem? This is doing better in the West than it did in the East, better than blue purple in fact, and was also inarguably, I think, the best deck of the EBO2 format in the West, although that format was fairly short. So I do think they're very likely to hit something in this deck as well. If you get rid of blue purple, I think this just becomes the next menace, and with this already performing as well as blue purple, and according to the TCG matchmaking data, the green purple actually has a slightly losing matchup into blue purple around 52-48, so nothing too significant, but worth noting nonetheless. I would be very surprised if nothing in this deck gets hit. Again, I think Gum Gum Giant is probably going to get hit in some way. I just don't think this card is balanced at this point in the game. Maybe in 4 or 5 sets time, once we've got similarly powerful counter events for other colors and other archetypes, this card can come back. But right now, this is just way too efficient. And this is a deck that should care about this Don -2. And if you are reckless with your play, this deck can care about the Don -2. But the efficiency of Sanji and Pudding in regenerating those Dons, and the fact that it's so hard to interact with, mainly because of this card going Merry, on curve, means that green purple Luffy is reliably able to stack 2 Sanji and Puddings more often than not, and from there you're getting all your Don back with your leader effect. Your leader effect's not costing you anything, and with cards like Frankie, and if you can get a 3rd Sanji and Pudding, you can actually just start ramping, so you're just benefiting off of this leader effect, which is kind of wild. In addition, this deck just having access to so many searches makes it so consistent. It's very rare for you to play against green purple Luffy and they don't draw well. And we've seen that echoed in its results. It's a very consistent deck that consistently tops at most events. So if Gum Gum Giant is getting hit, I personally don't think you need to hit anything else in this deck. The leader, I don't think there's any need to ban this, and I've seen people talking about banning Sanji and Pudding. And equally, I think if you ban Sanji and Pudding, you may as well just ban the leader. That literally just kills the deck. There's no way banning Sanji Pudding is a good idea. The one thing I could see them banning, if in the world where they didn't ban Gum Gum Giant, or restrict Gum Gum Giant, I think you could touch Merry. The fact that Merry just draws you another card means you're basically playing a 46 card deck, because you're more than happy to just drop this for 1 on most turns. You get so many extra Dons with this deck after all. So this has very little opportunity cost to playing it, and the amount of value you can get out of this by hitting certain breakers is bonkers. You can put your Sanji Pudding outside the range of cards like Jozu, cards like Raging Tiger, cards like 9-cost Big Mum, and also yellow cards like Damned Punk or the 5-cost Egghead Nami. You just take your stuff outside the range of a lot of removal outside of black for one turn, and that one turn is all green purple needs to establish a Luffy Taro into a second Sanji Pudding. And then you're just firing on all cylinders, and there's too many threats for your opponent to deal with. So in that way, the Going Merry can be a problem very early in the game. As the game progresses, this card gets less effective because you're going to have multiple copies of a lot of your cards on the board. So buffing them all with Going Merry above thresholds that matter becomes more difficult. But especially in the early game, a Going Merry can be incredibly powerful. However, I think if you ban or restrict Gum Gum Giant, that will hurt this deck enough, because this deck is currently very, very greedy on the amount of bricks it plays. That's no secret. Gum Gum Giant enabling you to trash those bricks, counter out, and draw cards is just kind of insane in this deck once you get to a Don count where you can afford to play it. So if they do hit Gum Gum Giant, my prediction is nothing else will get hit in this deck. But if for some reason they don't hit Gum Gum Giant, I think you should hit something in this deck, likely the Going Merry, just to give your opponent a little bit more counterplay. Now, is Zoro also worth discussion? Well, I think it's a little too early to call on some of this. He's only been out for, half a set at this point. The leader is here just to demonstrate what we're talking about. I've not seen anyone calling for the ban of this leader. He's just here, so this is in relation to the deck that I'm talking about. Toshigi, I think, is a ridiculous card. We've obviously not had any OP12 events in the West yet, but from my OP12 testing online and sort of watching gameplay of regionals, this card is incredibly overstated for what it is. This is a 2/7 that rests a 6. That's bonkers. And the fact that this hits original cost as well means that your opponent doesn't have a way to get around this. If you're playing cards with increased cost like Hack or the 6-cost Kuzan, or if you're playing a Beer Luffy in your purple-black Luffy deck, well, Toshigi doesn't care. Toshigi just rests whatever the hell she likes. I personally wouldn't be surprised if Green Zoro's dominance continues to see people calling for a ban of this card in the future. But I think right now it's just too early to say. This deck and this card have not been out for long enough to discuss bans at this point. However, Hody Jones is a card I've seen a lot of people talking about. I could see this one. I think Hody Jones is obviously a very powerful card, and the only reason Hody Jones hasn't been that great leading up to this point is Green has been kind of trash. And whilst Bonnie has always played Hody Jones, Bonnie's been a much slower deck. It's not been able to close out a game super early with Hody Jones in a way similar to a deck like Zoro or GY Law or RG Smoker can. They have also just printed the Dead Man's Game event, which has Hody Jones' on play minus the life take on a 4-cost event that's also a 3k counter. But you could look at that both ways. You could look at that as they've printed a replacement if they have to ban Hody. But you could also look at it as a test, and some decks have preferred the Dead Man's Game. I must say, when I've been looking at deck lists as the format in Japan has gone on, I've seen more and more Hody in Zoro and less Dead Man's Game. That's purely anecdotal. I've not got the stats on that. However, it certainly feels like Hody's increasing in popularity. And Hody's also just way better in the mid-game. Dropping a 7-8 that rests 2 of their guys is a good play on, like, I don't know, your 8-9 Don turn. Playing Dead Man's Game on 9 is significantly worse, because whilst yes, you rest those guys, and you can swing a couple times with your lead, you don't have a 7-8 that the opponent's got to deal with. So once they get over the pressure that you've put on that turn, you've not actually, like, built anything on your board, which obviously Hody is a very meaningful body, even after the tourney comes down. Will we see a ban of Hody? I don't personally think so. I think the power of Hody, whilst obviously getting stronger and stronger as more aggressive green decks are coming out, is very much exacerbated at the moment by the prevalence of Gum Gum Giant. In a format where people aren't playing as many counter events, Hody is significantly weaker, because whilst yes, he can rest blockers, if your primary way of countering is with counter, instead of relying on cards like Gum Gum Giant to trash your bricks and draw you into good stuff, Hody's obviously much less effective. And if we see the format move back towards more removal, which Blue Bubble Luffy is just very good into removal because all his cards are so big, Green struggles into removal traditionally. You don't get a board. If you don't get a board, Hody is worse. So personally, I don't think anything in Green Zoro is worth touching right now. However, I could see them hitting Hody if they really wanted to. and I'd put a watch this space on Tashigi because I could see this card getting banned in the future. This card is insane value. Maybe that's just my cape. We'll see, we'll see. So anything else? For me, I'd love to see this guy gone. I hate this card. This card is so boring. You can't interact with it with anything. It can't be removed from the field by any effects because it's just got that tag. And it's also just incredibly hard to rest it because resting is generally an on-play. Outside of cards like Straw Sword and Dead Man's Game, like the ways to rest this Kuzan are so few and far between that I really would not be upset to see this guy go. This is fixed like the only problem Blackbeard had. Blackbeard already had really good removal, and his problem was he ran out of cards. Well, you just don't run out of cards anymore with Kuzan, because Kuzan can summon Burgess or Van Augur, and you don't lose any cards in hand. The 6-cost Kuzan can summon this 5-cost Kuzan, and then you get to swing with this, and then draw a card, so you don't lose any cards in hand, and you get to end that chain with a Van Augur or a Burgess. I think this card is really bad design, at least for me, and maybe this is just because I don't like playing into Blackbeard, but the fact that they just get to draw so many cards off these Kuzans, I don't know. I feel like the Blackbeard deck should have the weakness of lacking resources. That's how his leader effect is designed after all. But with this Kuzan, you just don't run out of resources in the same way that you used to back in OP09. And it makes playing into Blackbeard with any deck that has like a slightly losing matchup into Blackbeard in theory just borderline impossible because this card exists and they draw so many cards off of it. Maybe this is just me coping, but I would love to see a Kuzan ban. And they have banned things sort of like predictively in the past, so you never know. So unbans, I think this is the tier list of unbans that I've created. The 2 stages, there's no way. Stages are so uninteresting. Ennie's lobby especially giving -2 every turn is ridiculous. Moby Dick, especially with a new Ace leader coming. Whilst obviously that doesn't buff Ace, buffs all these characters, I just don't think they'll bring that back. RP Laws never coming back unless we see insane power creep or Black Maria get banned. Ice Age, they just recently got banned. There's no way to bring that back. And Moria is the same. Both Ice Age and Moria are just ridiculously powerful. I don't see those cards coming back anytime soon. In the probably not fine category, I've got Kabaji. I don't think they would bring this back just because they wouldn't want to buff Nami like so soon before it rotates and end up turning it into a tier 1 deck. I don't know if Kabaji would do that, but I just don't think Bandai will take the chance. Also, this makes Nami more boring because Nami then just plays its own game as opposing to having to use like the counter events to interact with your opponent's swings. Great Eruption, probably not fine. I think as long as Tempest Kick exists, there's no real reason for them to bring this back. You'd effectively have 8 copies of the same card, except Tempest Kick obviously is more powerful, but has that condition. So I just don't see Great Eruption coming back. And the same with Reject. They have printed sort of this effect on that Bonnie, right? That new 9-cost Bonnie. However, that is your entire play for the turn. Whereas Reject, you can follow up with cards like a Maru to rest your opponent's stuff more easily. I would be interested to see how this feels now, because, I mean, Yellow is not in the best spot right now. But I just don't see them bringing it back. I think there would be a lot of uproar if they did. Jinbei, if they wanted to bring Jinbei back, I honestly think this would be fine. Dofi and, by extension, Boa are doing absolutely nothing. I think the power creep of EBO2 and OP11 has kind of just shut those decks out because there's so many more 6k leaders that are hard for Dofi and Boa to just attack into. So many of Dofi's cards, I mean, look at the most powerful cards in the deck were the Jinbei and the Law. They're both 5k units, and into, like, especially blue-purple, Law doesn't bounce anything relevant. You bounce my Mr. 2, oh no, I don't care. So I really think they could bring Jinbei back, and Dofi would probably be more than fine. However, I just don't think they will, because they've released that updated version in PRBO2. That's the only reason I think this won't come back, but without testing, obviously, I think this would be probably fine. Raygo felt quite weird at the time. Like, they effectively nuked BY, so you can't argue that they needed to ban this for BY. So for me, this was banned because of Enel, but Enel wasn't doing that great at the time, and Enel is certainly not doing great now. This card was quite toxic in Enel, and personally I wasn't that upset to see it go. However, I think it was a bit of a weird ban, and I could see it being fine if they brought it back, but again, I don't think they will, because those bans were really recent, and they seem quite odd at the time, so they must have had a specific reason in mind that they've just not properly communicated to us. And for me, the one that might actually happen is Saka Leader. So when Saka Leader got banned, you had Ice Age, you had Eruption, you had Moria. All three of those cards are now banned. There's no way this guy's still broken, right? Tempest Kick is harder to use in this deck than it is in Lucci, so you're going to be incredibly reliant on like the set 2 and starter deck 6 Navy cards. And Black has had like no buffs in terms of its removal aspect in quite a while. So I really don't see how this guy would be too broken anymore. Maybe this is just, maybe we need to test it with him, and I would actually be quite interested in doing a Saka video on the channel. Let me know if you've been interested in that, trying out Saka, seeing if he can compete with the top decks now, assuming blue-purple gets hit in some way. So seeing if he can compete into decks like green-purple, and maybe like Bello Benny, or Green Zorro. I think that could be quite interesting. I do think there is a real chance of Saka coming back. A full life leader with sort of minimal defense outside of obviously his removal doesn't spark joy. And that 6-cost Rush Luffy especially, being able to swing twice into this guy, I think that would be pretty saucy. I don't have a ton to say on this one, but I do think there is a chance Saka comes back. With 3 of his best cards now banned, I just don't see this guy being as broken as he used to be, anywhere near it. We've progressed a long way since like set 6. And finally, here is my prediction. I think Big Mum will be banned. I think Kuzan will be banned. I think Gum Gum Giant's going to be limited to 1 copy. This keeps it as a nice option for the Luffy decks, but it stops people chaining them. Like, when you're playing against Luffy, at least for me, the first Gum Gum Giant is like, right, they've got a giant. Right, we've burned the giant. Then they drop the second giant, and the third giant, and the fourth giant, and you're like, ugh, how do you die? You don't die. So I think limiting this to 1 will keep it as a really powerful option for the Luffy decks to give them some longevity, while stopping the chaining, just to making the purple Luffys feel unkillable. In addition, this is like somewhat lore accurate, right? Because like after Luffy goes Gear 5th, spoiler alert, he turns into like the shriveled up old man form. At least from what I've seen. I've not quite got to Wano yet, but that's what I've seen from sort of things online. So limiting this to 1 copy once per game, I don't know, that could be kind of funky. And also, I think it's time. Free my boy, free my boy. This is the one I'm least confident in. I don't know if they're just not going to unban cards anymore. And if Saka doesn't get unbanned in this ban list, I think it's very unlikely anything gets unbanned, like, for the foreseeable future. I think that will demonstrate to me that they're not interested in unbanning cards. They'd rather just play safe and leave them banned. So, we'll see. Let me know in the comments, what would you ban? Would you unban anything? Do you think a limit on Gum Gum Giant could be the way? Let me know what you think. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.